Hello, my name is Sheppard Skaerved and I'm a violinist. I'm standing here in the Whittall Pavilion of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. And this project is part of a collaboration between the library and the Royal Academy of Music in London, where I am the Viotti lecturer. And it also forms part of a project of mine sponsored by Research England called Knowledge Exchange Violin. And the purpose of the project is in the title. It's simply by looking at how we use instruments and how music is a presence in our lives, how it talks to some of the questions of how we communicate, how we use nature, how we use natural materials in order to make art, and to ask some bigger questions about where we're going, what our obligation is to each other and to the natural world. I'm standing here with an extraordinary instrument. This is an instrument made in Lombardy, in Cremona, by Nicolo Amati. Nicolo's grandfather, Andrea, is one of the people credited with making the form of the violin as we know it now. He had an extraordinarily long career. The earliest dated instrument of his, that's the first when he was allowed to have a label which was truly his, as opposed to working on an instrument which was made by his father Girolamo, is 1629. And the latest instrument is round about the time of his death, 1665. This instrument dates from 1654, and it is the epitome of what is known sometimes as the grand pattern of instruments. This model of the violin, which was named because of a certain heft and a certain nobility to its shape, became the model for pretty much the next 3 generations of violin makers. Indeed, there is an instrument in one of the cases behind me by Guarneris del Gesù, the Fritz Kreisler violin, was made on molds which had come to him from Amati's workshop, effectively a mold which is similar to this instrument. Things to look at in an instrument, of course, is, well, the most important thing is what it's made from. Instrument is made from spruce and from maple, and one of the things I always like to point out is that first and foremost, even before you start thinking about sound, and in truth, something of the making of these instruments, this might have even be more important than sound to begin with, is the decorative celebration of a beautiful piece of wood. If I show this, and I've done it, if I show an instrument like this to a carpenter or a joiner, they will immediately say, I wish I could work with a piece of wood like the back of this instrument. And one of the beautiful things about all the geometry of here, these beautiful arcs of the instrument, is that first and foremost, the makers are looking for a way to most beautifully celebrate this glorious flamed piece of wood here, which has been cut, as it's sometimes called, on the slab. So that's close to the, across the grain of the tree. So you get a flame going one way and almost like a contour map going the other way when you look at it. Other things, and perhaps in Washington, this is worth bringing up, is that a violin is, in the true sense, a classical piece of design. And I'm not talking about whatever we regard the strictures of whatever classical music might be. It's just that if you look at the scroll here, and if you were to imagine another one on the other side, you're looking at the Ionic capital. This is architectural order going on here of a Greek or Roman temple. And we could walk out of the door here and find plenty of these on the buildings around us. But perhaps the most poignant thing to say about an instrument is a thing which perhaps players don't think about that much, which is the names we use for it. Because the names we use for the parts of the instrument give us the clue as to what an instrument actually is. We use the words neck and shoulders, back and belly and ribs. And then when you hold the instrument, you realize you're looking at a simplified or maybe enhanced notion of the human form. If you think of ancient Greek Cycladic art, you'll find human figures in this so-called violin form, and it remains in Anatolian, in Turkish folk art, as a figure to this day. But there are some more exciting things about these instruments, and some to do with a much deeper history. An instrument like this, when it was made, would not often have been seen as it is exhibited in the cases behind us or as it's held today. These instruments were in many ways designed when they were first played to be held down like this. And this brings in a really exciting part of the next level of the classical design, which is, so violinists called these holes in the front of the belly either sound holes or F holes. But they're only F holes if you hold the violin this way up. When the violin is held as it was designed to be heard in the late 16th or early 17th century, something very interesting happens if you look at it, which is, this is the shape of a lyre. Here is the instrument of Apollo, and anyone who looks underneath an old grand piano will recognize this shape. There is the bridge of the lyre, there's the two sides, and there are the strings. Apollo, of course, was a string player. So encoded into the instrument is the idea of the classical history. What's very exciting about this violin is that unlike most of the instruments surviving from the great Cremonese age of violin making, which ranges from the end of the 1500s, in terms of its perception globally into the end of the 1700s, is that nearly 100% of the instruments which survive from that period were substantially converted or changed at the very end of the 18th century through actually into the beginning of the 20th century. And the neck of the instrument was re-angled. And the exciting thing about this is if you look at the shape and the angle of the neck here, it is quite flat. When you look at instruments as they were converted, you'll find, we'll look at it later, the neck is tilted back. And in addition, the shape here with the converted instrument has got more of a cutaway, enabling high positions to be played. And the most obvious difference is the length of this, the bit we call the fingerboard, quite literally because it's the bit we touch, which is the top note on this, if I play it, is roughly an A. Whereas on the modern fingerboard, which stands up to about here. So that was extended to enable accurate playing leaning into the fingerboard much higher up. Perhaps the most substantive difference between the old instruments and the old setup and the new setup was the technology of the strings themselves. And this happened very, very gradually. And of course, in the past 50 years, there's been quite a to and fro with it, which is if you look closely here, you'll see that the top three strings here are uncovered gut. This is completely organic material. And perhaps the biggest difference between a violin in, we're going to use the word modern setup, and a violin in early setup is the amount of metal in or on the instrument. This instrument has metal in only one place, which is the winding on the lower string, the G string. Whereas, as you'll see in a minute, a modern setup violin has got all kinds of metal. There is wire on the strings, there is metal with a fine tuner, the adjuster here, and there is metal if there's a shoulder rest. So it means that the instrument itself is also a lot lighter. But I haven't talked about sound. And there are two aspects to this. The one which is most often talked about is to do with volume. The idea that in the 19th century, orchestras started to get bigger, concert halls started to get bigger, and the need for a violin to project became very important. And if you think about the work of composers such as Hector Berlioz, influenced by Beethoven, they were making the orchestra bigger and louder. If I were to play anything on this violin as it speaks naturally, you'll hear that naturally it is a delicate instrument. But there's something more than just volume. It's a little bit to do with the bow. The design of the bow that I'm holding here is roughly contemporaneous with the instrument. So this is made by a living bow maker, an archetier, as it is, the word we use today. He's made by a man called Antonino Airenti of Genoa, and he made this bow for me. And you'll see it's a different shape from the modern bow. It is concave, it is convex, not concave, and it is shorter, and has very few hairs. And the result of that is that the bow itself has almost no natural weight. Any weight going into the string comes from the arm, and the first thing the bow will do is to release. Perhaps the simplest way of expressing the difference between what this bow does and the modern bow does is that this bow tends to speak more than it sings. So if I was to play a bit of Bach, immediately the bow starts making space between the notes. The moment I stop moving, it stops moving. Even if I play... And this has a great relationship to the use of words, the relationship of words to music, and most particularly to poetry. With an instrument set up like this, it's very easy to scan a melody, to have it do what Shakespeare does. So if I play a simple melody, and if I play, for instance, so that effectively works like a quatrain. It has 4 feet. 1. And it has an iambic form. This bow will do da, 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 very naturally. There are very few great Cremonese instruments in original setup like this. And it's an enormous privilege to have the chance to play one, and especially to play one which is in such an amazing condition as this. And perhaps the last thing to say about this would be that we have found, working with the composer Michael Allegros, who has written works for this instrument in this state, that it's not just a question of giving us access to something of the past. When you look at an instrument like this, set up like this in the past, it gives you different possibilities for where you might go in the future. So the new music he's written for this instrument in old form doesn't sound like old music. It sounds like a new way, a different way of hearing, which is a good argument for making sure that we listen and look carefully at objects from the past. So I first came to work at the Library of Congress in 2006, and I didn't come because of musical instruments. I came because the great American composer Elliott Schwartz was handing his archive of manuscripts to the collection. Before I arrived, I was contacted by somebody who was going to become a very dear collaborator, Caroline Ward-Bamford, who's with us here. And she said, well, you know, what instrument would you like to play on? And I said, what do you mean? I know there are instruments there. I wasn't aware that I was going to get that option. And then she said, would you like to play on Fritz Kreisler's Del Gesù? And that instrument is behind me in a case over there. Now, as a teenager, the photographs I had on my wall were of violins. I had a photograph of that violin on my wall. I've never forgotten the moment that she brought the case out, opened the case, and there was this instrument I already knew completely. I know that instrument so well. You know, it's got a very distinctive tailpiece, this part of the instrument, which was a tailpiece made in Paris in the 19th century. But in the instrument case as well, there were two bows, which I immediately recognized as being English bows. They're made by a company called Hill, and they're called fleur-de-lis bows, because instead of having a dot there, they have a sign, the fleur-de-lis, the lily. So I said, well, am I allowed to play one of Fritz Kreisler's bows? Absolutely. So I went on stage, and this historic stage, which is behind the Whittall Pavilion here, just on the other side of the wall there, is what is for musicians absolutely holy ground. The place where the Budapest Quartet recorded, where Béla Bartók and Joseph Szigeti recorded what is generally regarded as being the greatest violin piano recital ever given, not long before Bartók died, and where Copland's Appalachian Spring was premiered. So I found, you know, a Brit, I found myself walking out on stage, that stage, to play Schubert, playing Fritz Kreisler's violin and his bow. And at that moment, I realized something very exciting, which was the most honest and personal thing that I could do was in some ways to give up. Because the instrument and the person who played it and the makers and the room knew what I was going to do better than I did. And at that moment, I realized, and this place continues to teach me, that the most personal, the most honest, the most individual thing that we can do is to surrender ourselves to being part of, to being among voices, the voices of the people who, yes, went before us, but are among us. In the case of the cases here, Antonio Stradivari, Nicolo Amati, and Guarnerius del Gesù. And this is a great place to come and think about that. As a musician, this is going to sound strange, I regard this room as one of my favorite playgrounds. It's a place, literally, in every sense, to play. So this instrument here is, until recently, was the instrument from the collection I perhaps knew least. It is an Antonio Stradivari violin made in 1700. The first thing to say is that one of the most amazing things about the Cremonese makers was that one of the reasons for their historic primacy was that they were extraordinarily long-lived. Antonio Stradivari's first labeled violin, that's the first violin where we know he was not an apprentice, dates from 1665. I've played one of his from 1666. His last labeled violin there's dispute as to whether it is 1734 or 1736. He died in 1737. I know one instrument very well from 1734, a wonderful violin which has the title the Habeneck violin. This meant that he had a 7-decade making career. And when you bear in mind that Nicolo Amati, whose mantle he took over, had a 58-year making career from first labeled instrument in 1629 to last in 1665, to 1685, basically 19 years after Stradivarius. Between two people, they had a 106-year domination of the field. So that means just like artists. If you think about an artist like Picasso, for instance, we expect that artists are going to have different approaches, different periods in their life. You can watch Picasso finding his way from the Blue period to his work with Georges Braque in the Cubist work and in the influence of the Surrealists. The same with composers like Igor Stravinsky. And so it is with makers like Antonino Stradivari. This instrument stands at the beginning of what came to be known as his golden period. Nobody could really agree why that was. Some people say it's because these were the best instruments. That doesn't interest me that much. Others, because this is at the moment that this particular quality of varnish begins to appear. But it's really from the end of the 1690s when he establishes a design, or should we say a refinement of the design of the violin, which would dominate violin making really until this day. And this instrument stands at the beginning of this. Like all violins, the basic woods of the instrument are twofold. We have maple on the back here, and we have spruce. The back is in one piece, and you can see why a carpenter or a joiner would choose this glorious piece of wood, even with the beautiful ground and varnish which Antonio Stradivari laid onto it, and which has been wiped away very artistically here. One of the most wonderful things about instruments is the patina of age, the fact that they acquire a particular wear pattern from being used. This wear pattern would not be produced if this instrument was played today, because the wear of this is from the instrument for the first 100 years of its life being played along the arm with a lot of material rubbing there. So a violinist plays the violin today, they're not rubbing there. But if it was being played low with a lot of material, that explains this shape. You'll even notice something in terms of the wear of instruments on the back of what we call the scroll or the head of the violin here, that this bit is always a little bit smooth. And the reason for that is for the first, certainly the first 150 years of its life, the cases that this instrument would have been kept in, whether they were traveling cases, which would have been rare, or when they were being kept in the court where it may have been kept, the traveling cases and the shelves they were kept in, the instrument would be slid into the case or onto the shelf like that, rubbing away the back of what we call the fluting on the back of the scroll here. So one of the most exciting things about a violin is the marks of time on it. You'll notice that instruments tend to have a slight wear on this side of what we call the tailpiece. Much of that wear actually comes from the middle of the 19th century, where men stopped shaving as much as they used to and started to wear beards. Shaving strop manufacturers went out of business for a while in the middle of the 19th century. If you think about it, Brahms grew a beard, and a man playing a beard here will rub away the varnish. The Nicolo Amati violin, which I was playing earlier, has got a lot of beard damage here. You'll find that the varnish on the back of the instrument here tends to be duller because it's been close to the player. There will also be more damage on this side of the instrument than that because twofold. One, the bow is held here, which means if you're too enthusiastic, you're very likely to hit the side of the instrument. And secondly, because in order to adjust the most important part of the violin, which most people never see, which is called the sound post, which is a piece of dowel which doesn't hold up the top of the instrument, but which is gently wedged between the top of the instrument and the back, roughly there. This is adjusted with a curved piece of metal with a point on the end of it through this F-hole here. And of course, in doing that, that will rub away at some of the detail there, although this instrument has been very, very beautifully cared for, and there's very little damage there. But there's also another mark of time on an instrument on this, and we've been thinking about this quite a lot in the past 2 days. What is it that makes the character of an instrument made from organic materials like this? And one of the things that we've been talking about, and having a composer, Michael Allegros, here to think about this really helps, is that if you look at the front of this instrument, you'll see the relatively wide grain of the spruce on the front of the instrument. Each of these lines is, obviously, the dark line is for a winter. And you can see that some of them are harder winters. Indeed, some instruments, you'll see that the grains will shake. You'll see that even more often on bows. That's sometimes when a lightning bolt has hit a tree, and it's called a thundershake. And you'll get a quiver in the wood. And if you play many, many notes on the violin, or even a few, there's no question that the actual history, the organic breathing nature of the wood will affect what you do. It's not just the sound, it's the way each of these things vibrates. So this instrument is in what we call modern form. So to get to that in reverse order, that means I'll introduce the parts of it which were introduced the latest. So it has what we call a chin rest here, which in many ways, its most important job is to protect the violin from me. Some people hold the instrument with a chin rest, and they sometimes have a thing called a shoulder rest in the past 100 years under here, which I can't bring myself to do. But I hold the instrument there and just rest my chin there. So this shoulder rest is, if you like, is lightly clamped onto the back of the instrument as lightly as possible. The good thing is that this part of any violin has a block here and there, which means that you can put a bit of pressure onto the block without affecting the delicacy of the rest of the instrument, because, terrifyingly, the thickness of this part of the instrument, which we call the ribs, is often under 0.5 millimeter. This is thinner than a piece of fine aerogram paper, if you can remember that. But let's go back to the modern setup. The most important difference in terms of how instruments were changed is to do with the angle of the neck here and the nature of the bridge here. If I play this instrument, immediately you'll recognize what people would think of as the Stradivari sound, the Cremona sound, this kind of and high on the instrument. This kind of wonderful lushness. Now, of course, much of that is to do with the bow that I'm using, but it's also to do with the fact that at the end of the 1700s, a number of makers and inventors, primarily in Italy and in the UK, started to play with the idea that you could develop the sound of what was already existing by angling the neck back, effectively changing the angle of the strings to the bridge. Also, in some cases, but not all, a thing called the bass bar, which is an invisible fillet of wood on this side of the instrument, which runs inside the instrument along here, was sometimes made bigger and thicker. That's the part of the instrument which transfers the bass sound, this side of the instrument, across the front of the instrument, makes it ring. And gradually, on top of that, the bridge became more solid, more sturdier. Now, obviously, part of that was to do with volume, but another part of it was to do with how sound connects. So I can demonstrate this very quickly. If I play this instrument, even in the modern setup, with a bow, which is actually slightly earlier than this time this instrument was made. So this is a bow from the 1680s, a copy of one. So if I play some music from the time this instrument was written, say some Torelli. You'll hear the shortness of this bow and it immediately makes the instrument speak more than it sings. If I jump forward roughly 30, 40 years, and I'll show you this. So if I hold the two bows up now, say we have the bow from the late 17th century, and we have a bow made towards the end, or the design made towards the end of Stradivarius' life. This is a bow based on a design used by Giuseppe Tartini, who worked in Padua. You'll notice it is about the hair, or the usable hair is about 5 centimeters longer. It's heavier, and there is more hair. Not much. This one has about maybe 70 hairs on it. This probably got about 100. If I was to play music from Tartini's time, you get this. So you hear already something is happening. There's more, in the broadest sense, singing going on. It's not quite that notion of legato, which we would recognize today, but we're on the way. Because if I put the violin down for a moment now and hold the three bows up, we can go from the late 1600s to the mid-1700s, and then lightning strikes, and we get this design. So both of these designs here are fundamentally Italian bows. But in the 1780s and 1790s, Amati's and particularly Stradivari instruments found their way to Paris. Mainly they found their way to Paris in the hands of an Italian-born violinist called Giovanni Battista Fiotti, who became the most important violinist probably of all time. And he started working with bow makers in Paris alongside some of his colleagues. And gradually they came up with this design, which was perfected by a man called François Tourte. Indeed, in the case behind us, there is a François Tourte bow made and owned by one of Fiotti's greatest pupils, Pierre Bayot. And the most important difference between this is that if I loosen this bow, you can see this clearly. This bow bows toward the strings, and this bow goes away. Now, the most important result of that is counterintuitive. With a bow which is convex like this, when you press down hard, the hair gets tighter. And this, I love this. With a concave bow, because of the shape, for the first moment that you press down the bow hair gets shorter, gets longer. So if I press this down, it actually narrows the distance between here and here and makes the bow briefly, whilst there's more weight going into it, it means it's slightly looser, which means I can attack the string without it cracking. But let me play you a moment of what was happening in Paris in, say, the 1820s. Do you remember I began with, if you like, speech. Something like, or that's the sound of the 1690s, and then maybe the sound of the 1740s. Which is more joined up. And then we get to the sound of, say, the 1820s. And you can see immediately a new notion of line emerging. It's worth saying that this was being driven by the most popular demand for music, which wasn't in concert halls, and by the beginning of the 1800s, it was no longer in church. It was the demand of dance music. And of course, if you think of it, if you go back to the early 18th century, a minuet by Bach goes it's poised, it's elegant, but it's hardly sweeping. Even when Bach makes a passe-pied, even though the line is longer, there's still this catch and release. But of course, by the time you get to the middle of the 19th century, and you only need to think of it in terms of couture, the difference between somebody wearing an 18th century bustle and the clothes quite stiff and everybody on high and heels, men as well, and very tight corseting. But then you get to the feeling of the great age of the Viennese waltz or the Russian waltz, and you get there's a great notion of sweep, and that perhaps is the biggest difference. That's the development. It's being driven by popular music. And I think one of the biggest problems we have with thinking about classical music today is thinking that it's stopped being perceived as being the popular genre, but until well into the 20th century, it was, and that was what was driving it. And over the past 100 years, there was a couple more technical changes with regard to sound and technology. This instrument has substantially more metal on it than instrument in Baroque form. There is, in terms of tuning, there's this thing here, which is called a fine tuner, or in Europe we call it an adjuster. And that's because the top string here is basically a piece of wire. The other strings are wound, there's synthetic material inside, a synthetic gut, effectively, with a very, very tight winding around it. There is, of course, an interesting question to be had from this. This instrument in modern setup, how much of the past is actually there? Well, the interesting thing, I would say, is that if you allow it to be there, it's certainly still there. So if I play Purcell, then the original heart of the instrument is still there. And even in a modern setup like this, we can find our way back to the sound where it started, although it's worth saying that a lot of what we use these instruments to do today would not be recognized by their makers from 300 years ago. And that's perhaps the kind of most amazing place to finish with this, which is that even though this instrument here is 323 years old, I know from personal experience that composers still find that it has much more to offer them. They can't find the limit of it. It's a tool, a machine which goes on giving. It's still offering things for the future. It may be a historical object, but it has incredible relevance in terms of the art and expression of our own time.